Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Gaia Education Glocalisers webinar series. My name is Giovanni Charlo. I am the Academic and E-Learning Coordinator at Gaia Education. Today, I am very excited to bring to you this webinar entitled Designing for Regeneration and Planetary Health: How to Facilitate the Emergence of Positive Change at Local, Bioregional, and Global Scales. This webinar is presented by my dear friend and Gaia Education collaborator, Daniel Wahl. This webinar series is offered to build capacity in systems thinking design. Some housekeeping tips to start with. This webinar will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel for those that cannot make it to the live presentation. Please close any open programs that you don't need at this time to have a better bandwidth and not interfere with the webinar. Your microphone and video will be turned off during the webinar, but you can communicate with your host and panelists via the chat box or the question and answer area. Please post questions in the question and answer area only so that your panelist, Daniel, can respond from there at the end of his presentation. I also want to point out some resources the Gaia Education makes available on our website, such as the EDE curriculum, activity guides, the 4 key publications, and our new book, Eco-Villages Around the World. These also include the Sustainable Development Sustainable Development Goals flashcards, which are now available in multiple languages. And we have recently launched the Trainers of Multipliers handbook, also developed by Daniel, for leading meaningful discussions on how to implement the SDGs in your community or organization. So visit the address on the screen for these publications. Some are free to download. You're invited to check out our online courses.
Gio?
Yes.
Shit.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, our online courses are offered in a yearly cycle. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry, I heard some noise in the background. Our online courses are in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and all 3 of these are starting this week, as a matter of fact, with the social design in English and Spanish and the worldview design in Portuguese. For today's webinar, sorry, a couple more things here. You can find out more about Gaia Education through our social media presence, and learn how to become a Gaia Education certified trainer, like a growing list of trainers on our roster. And finally, you can subscribe also to our newsletter by going to our website. Okay, these are a little bit out of order. I'm sorry about that. But for today's webinar, I have the great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Daniel Wahl. Daniel has been working on integrated whole systems approaches to ecological design, sustainability, planetary health, and regenerative development for more than 20 years. His 2006 PhD dissertation on design for human and planetary health was an early contribution to this emerging transdisciplinary approach to health and sustainability. Since the publication of his book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, in 2016, and through his active social media work, Daniel has become a thought leader and weaver of international collaboration and global implementation of regenerative practices. In this webinar, he will share some reflections and useful frameworks that can help global change to facilitate the emergence of positive change at a local, bioregional, and global scale. So, thank you, Daniel. It's really an honor to be with you here today.
Are you? Mm-hmm. Let's see. Okay, am I live? Everything go? Wonderful to be with you all. just to let you know, I'm broadcasting from the Findhorn Foundation in the far north of Scotland. I just spent the last 4 days in a very intense meeting of the Findhorn Fellows and the Evolutionary Leaders Circle. And if I feel a bit tired, well, if I seem a bit tired, it's because I feel a bit tired, but it's wonderful to have this opportunity to connect with you all. And as Gio so kindly already mentioned, the title of my presentation is Designing for Regeneration and Planetary Health. I like to often start my presentations with this slide for a number of reasons. In the center of this slide, you see a little island. It's the island of Mallorca. That's where I currently live. And I also like this slide because it shows how drastic the planetary impact that we have is. This is from the International Space Station at night. And you can see the lights of different cities. On the island, that little half moon bay is the city of Palma, where I live. But I also like to point out this green line that you can see just above the curve of the globe. And that gives you an idea of how high the atmosphere actually is and how everything that we do, all our history, the evolution of life has happened within this thin band of life that spans our globe. And the challenge that we have now is to do what in the opening slide, this wonderful quote by Janine Benyus, life creates conditions conducive to life. That is really our job. And humanity hasn't done a very good job at doing that. And what this presentation really explores is how we might move back into the family of things and become guardians, healers, participants in a living planet in a more appropriate way. So many of you are familiar with the crisis. I've only got 3 of the slides for bad news because we're kind of inundated with bad news these days. In the top right corner of the screen is the planetary boundaries graph. We know that we're already overstepping a number of these boundaries, and we're not even sure some of them haven't been quantified yet, and we're likely to also be overstepping those. And the graph of the Great Acceleration, also by Will Steffen and his colleagues, shows that our resource use has grown exponentially, and the impact on the Earth system has also grown exponentially since particularly the beginning of the last century. And so it's really time to readdress the human presence on Earth, and design is a way of doing that. We're challenged within 1 generation to fundamentally redesign the human presence on Earth. I've also put up the graph of my friend and inspirational author, Kate Raworth, who points out that it's not just about planetary limits, we're also overstepping the social foundations. And this graph brings that home. It's from the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report that comes out every 2 years, and this is from the last one in 2017. And it shows that we live on an extremely unequal planet, and we will not be able to build a more sustainable or regenerative future for humanity without also creating a more equitable future for humanity. It is impossible to comprehend that 8.6% of humanity, if you're hearing a baby cry in the background, that's my daughter, and can't really do much about that. But so 8.6% are in ownership of 85.6% of the world's economic wealth. That's staggering. But what's even more staggering is that 71% of humanity have to share only 2.7% of the global economic wealth. And clearly that is an unsustainable system. And those of you who follow the bad news on climate change might have seen the recent report that came out at the beginning of last week, where the IPCC warned us that while we're not on track for Paris, we actually fundamentally have to go beyond all the agreements of Paris, and we have to stabilize global warming trends in such a way that we don't exceed an average warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. If we don't manage that, the challenges of implementing the the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or creating regenerative cultures in place all over the planet are very slim. And the graph below comes from Will Steffens and Ron Rockström's recent paper called Trajectories of the Earth Systems in the Anthropocene, the time where the Anthropocene is the time where the human impact on the planet has become a geological and climatic force, a biological force. We're literally hanging on the edge of this abyss into hothouse Earth. And we will see collapses at local and regional level and probably also national level in the coming decades. But the challenge is to avoid an entire global biospheric life support systems collapse and stabilize the Earth's climate within boundaries so higher life forms are still possible, and that includes us. So we've got work cut out, and if you look at the other images to the top left there, the image taken from the airplane, those lakes are basically lakes that are forming as the permafrost is melting. And these lakes are fizzing like a fizzy drink. They're off-gassing methane. And in that sense, while the dialogue of the IPCC always has been very conservative and people are somewhat alarmed that this time they have spoken out more strongly, I would say that they haven't spoken out strongly enough. They haven't used words like collapse, cataclysm, and the possible end of civilization as we know it, because that's really what we're facing. We are already in runaway climate change. We're in that little window of opportunity to maybe be able to reverse global climate change trends in such a way that we restabilize the climate towards the end of this century. But the difficulty is that we need to get people on board for a large global scale regeneration process and ecosystems restoration process that needs to start ideally yesterday. And at the same time, we need to be truthful to these people and say that even if we all come together and find an agreement at the scale of global civilization, humanity, we will still move into centuries of, into decades of collapse and a lot of severe climate catastrophes. So it's good to have this in mind as we start this journey, because otherwise people will feel like, oh, we're replanting the forests, we're rebuilding the soils, we're doing all the right things, and things are still happening, the catastrophes are still coming. And that's the lag in the climate system. That's why we've been so complacent, because the planetary system is enormously resilient. And really the climate effects that we're feeling right now are climate effects from emissions that happened in the 1980s. So if we stop emitting carbon and we actually get to a drawdown process of reversing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we will still, because of this time lag, see things worsening for a while before they get better. But there is hope if we get things together, if we work what seems to be a miracle, then we might restabilize climate in about 3 to 4 decades. So a Facebook friend of mine put it very succinctly by saying, we now are faced with a situation where we have to do the impossible because the probable is unthinkable. And let that just sort of melt on your tongue for a while, because that's really where we're at. In order to really understand how we got into this situation, we have to go upstream. We have to follow the river of design from its source, from the estuary where it ends in the ocean, all the way up into the mountains to the source. And as we look at the designs and the systems we've created, the processes that are currently driving our economy, our financial system, our transport systems, our cities, the designs we've created, further upstream is the how, what, and why we design, particularly the why. If we change the why, the how and the what changes. And this is influenced by the real and perceived needs. And these real and perceived needs in turn are influenced by the organizing ideas and the stories we tell about who we are, why we're here, what we're here for. who we are obliged to, and what kind of world do we want to hand over to the distant future, to future generations, the seventh generation yet unborn. And so even further up from that is the level or state of consciousness from which we make decisions. And if you look into the upper right corner of the screen, you see this circular relationship between worldview and design. Winston Churchill, always good for a good quote, said, "First we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us." This is true for pretty much all design. We create, like Tony Fry said, design goes on designing. We create designs, and these designs shape the world around us. And then living in that world, we begin to feel that the world we've created is also shaping the worldview we're in. So this is very central to the way that Gaia Education has approached design since its beginning. Like when everybody was talking about the three-legged stool of sustainability, social, economic, and ecological, Gaia Education said that this is not enough. We need the fourth dimension of sustainability and be really aware of that fourth dimension, and that is the worldview, the stories we tell. We need that new story that will shape how we move into the future. A way of making you understand what I mean by organizing idea. If you look at the screen in front of you, some of you will actually see just a circle, a black circle, within it a white pattern with black dots. And others will immediately see the head of an animal. But if I give you the organizing idea, head of a giraffe, then I can't see you right now, but then some of you might go, ah, I can see it. So for those who haven't seen it yet, from the bottom of the screen in the middle of that circle, that's where the neck's coming up. The top of the screen, the bigger black areas are the horns. A little bit up from the center, you can see the eye, and the giraffe is kind of looking towards the bottom right of the screen. Anyway, I hope you can see it now. And it is trying to, in an image, give you an idea how perception isn't a one-way process. It's not like there is an objective world out there that we just open our eyes and it comes in. Our organizing ideas and the stories we tell, the way we approach this world, actually shapes what we see. Heisenberg, the great physicist, said, we don't observe nature, we observe nature exposed to our method of questioning. And so if we change our method of questioning, a lot of things change. And that's really what the meta design of working at the worldview level of design is all about. I know that my good friend Joe Brewer is listening, and he's a, as he calls himself, an evangelist for the field of culture design. And that's also very much working with these same organizing ideas and the stories we tell, but also drawing from what we know about evolution and how evolution has worked in biology and in culture to consciously apply this knowledge to how we shape a sustainable regenerative culture in the future. Another way of expressing this comes from Professor Chris Argyris, who invented this idea of the ladder of inference. So we have the observable data, the experience out there, and then we select certain aspects of that data. And then we put meaning onto that selection of that data. And based on that meaning, we create basic assumptions about what influences that meaning and how the world works. We draw conclusions that shape our worldview, and that they shape our beliefs, and ultimately our beliefs then shape the why, what, and how we design. But what we often forget is that the beliefs, the organizing ideas, and the stories we hold affect how we select data in the first place, this reflexive loop. So this is really important to keep in mind as we move into this urgency of responding to the current global crisis. One of the organizing ideas that has been pervasive in our culture is that life is all about a struggle for survival in a world that has scarce resources, where only the fit and strong survive and the weak die. That is not really how evolution has moved. In the most broadest terms, evolution is a process of diversification and subsequent integration of that diversity created at a higher level of complexity. And if we look carefully, we realize that while competition exists, really that integration at higher levels of complexity more often than not happens through collaborative networks, new and novel forms of organization that are collaborative. So just to give you an example, eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus, were formed by the merging of two non-nucleated cells, but the one that engulfed the other didn't digest it and ate it up and killed it. It used it to create a whole that was more than the sum of its parts, a new type of cell. And these cells came together to create organs or multicellular organisms. And then they differentiated into organs, created more complex organisms. And these organisms then created social structures among them, whether it's a pack of wolves or a school of dolphins or a human community. And then even human communities reorganized themselves as cities were built into more complex living cities. If you look how cities organize themselves, they actually follow these patterns. So if we shift our understanding that life is not about competitive advantage, but about collaborative advantage, then a lot changes, and we can, with that understanding, redesign the human presence on Earth in such a way that we share abundance rather than compete over scarcity. Another way of putting this into the larger time frame comes from my friend and mentor, Robert Gilman, who says humanity has gone through three major phases, or two major phases, and we're moving into the third. The first one was the time when we were living in tribes and we were nomads. And then at some point, we started to develop agricultural practices that allowed us to stay in place and feed ourselves in a way that allowed us not to be nomadic anymore. And as that happened, we were able to give time to other practices, and we began to build cities, but we also began to lose our connection with nature, and some forms of agriculture in that early phase already began the long process of degenerative development, of releasing too much carbon into the atmosphere, of cutting down forests in order to create clearances in which we could grow up our food. And we've just gone through this long 5,000-year era of empires, of nations, of power over. And sometime in the Renaissance, we began to think differently about our relationship to the larger whole we were in. And we began to develop a science that, on the one hand, empowered the era of empires, and it gave us technologies that at some point were very good, in some ways were very good for humanity in terms of medicine, and lots of things in technology have been very beneficial to us. But it also gave us very intense destructive powers and weaponry. And so to some extent, the scientific revolution enabled the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution turbocharged degenerative development and emitting carbon, like particularly once we started burning coal and fossil fuels. But this 250-year trajectory into the planetary era reminds me that what I like about this graph is that now we're at the end of the era of empires, and what we see in so many places where the strong man is coming back, the nationalistic leaders who say our country first. It's part of the last rearing of the ugly head of the era of empires. Whether we want it or not, we are, with 7.6 billion people living in the planetary era. And either we understand that and co-create a regenerative and abundant, thriving future for all of humanity and all of life, or we see the final battle of the era of empire, and we take down thousands, if not 10,000s of species with us, and fundamentally reshape the planet in a way that it will not support higher life forms like us. It's really important that this is not about saving the planet. The planet, Gaia, has its own resilience mechanism that she will go on long beyond us. This is about saving our place on this planet. This is about our species growing up to a maturity that we can actually become conscious participants in life's processes, that we as cultures begin to understand that we are able to create conditions conducive to life, that we can not only learn from nature, but that we can design as nature. And that this has to be done with careful sensitivity to place and to the regions we inhabit, to the conditions of the ecosystems within which we live. And this graph really reminds me that cultural transformation process, civilizational change, runs in different timescales than our human life forms. We sometimes, or lifetimes, we sometimes get really disheartened that nothing is moving. But that's because we measure everything from the perspective of 60, 80, 85 years of lifetime. And so anything that starts taking decades or multiple decades or 50 years, we think, how desperately slow is this change? But really, in terms of civilizational transformation, the time from the Renaissance to now, 250 years, it's nothing. It's a blip. But also as we move into the future and we create this regenerative human presence on Earth, we have to think of ourselves as cathedral builders. This is a job that is intergenerational. Our generation has to begin to turn it around so we can hand on to the generation of my 14-month-old daughter a world where they can see that we've turned the tide, that we are on the right path, that the forests are coming back, that the rivers are coming back, that the water cycle and the carbon cycle are falling into balance again, that parts per million in the atmosphere are slowly dropping to 350 or even all the way to 280 parts per million, where it was before the Industrial Revolution. And as we do so, we will find that the climate will stabilize. So in 2006, after having done a master's at Schumacher College in Holistic Science in 2001 and 2002, where I met a professor who read my master's thesis and offered me to get me a PhD scholarship if I ever wanted to do a PhD. And so in 2003, I picked him up on that offer. Then in 2006, I published my PhD on design for human and planetary health, a holistic, integral approach to complexity and sustainability. And that picture of me proudly holding these 2 volumes, they're not 2 copies of the PhD, they're the 2 volumes of one PhD, is taken in June 2006. I had a brilliant supervisor called Professor Seaton Baxter at the University of Dundee, and some really amazing, my second supervisor is one of the pioneers of the ecological design movement, John Todd, who set up the New Alchemy Institute in 1969, a time when very few people were talking about this. And I remember one time talking to John and Nancy Jack Todd about what has changed. This was around 2006, just after my PhD. And they said to me, look, Daniel, when we started this, when we wrote the briefing paper for the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Environment, there was a group of us that we all knew each other by first name. There was about 40 or 50 of us around the planet, including Donella Meadows and people from Limits to Growth and so on, that really cared about this. Gregory Bates and Rachel Carson. Some of these people are now remembered as elders, E.F. Schumacher. And now there's already millions of us that understand the necessity of this change. And then I also had the great honor of having my PhD examined by somebody who's really been enormously influential on my life, Professor David Orr from Oberlin College. And one of the frameworks that helped me to explore what health at a planetary scale might look like what I understood, I thought I was going to do a PhD on design for sustainability. But I never really liked the word sustainability because it doesn't tell us what we're trying to sustain. And halfway through the PhD, I kind of realized that what we're trying to sustain is what Bateson would call the pattern that connects. The pattern of health that emerges. Health is an emergent property of a complex dynamic system that emerges at different levels of scale. And so picking up the work of a woman called Janice Birkeland, I expanded her scales of design to these scales of green chemistry, product design, architecture, community design, industrial ecology, urban planning, bioregional planning, and then national and international collaboration. And the importance as we design is to always ask the question, no matter what scale of design you're working on, how does this scale link to all the other scales? But in order to build planetary health, we need to start at the local and the bioregional level. And then that enables the emergence of health at the next higher level. So this is a key framework that really helps to understand why local and regional action is so important in the redesign of the human impact on Earth. And just recently, in August, I got a call from a professor from Sydney University, Professor Tony Capon, who was in Europe, and he asked me, between two conferences, I have a little bit of spare time, and I would love to come and see you on Mallorca and talk to you about your ideas on planetary health. And by that time, I'd kind of not forgotten about my PhD, but back when I published my PhD, I found it really hard to find research funding, and because it was too transdisciplinary and people wouldn't fund me, which was one of these beautiful moments where one door closes and another open. It led me to Findhorn and to run Findhorn College for 4 years, and it led me to work with Gaia Education. I used my last bit of postdoctoral research money to do Gaia Education's Eco-Village Design Education course at Findhorn, the very first one that was offered at Findhorn. And so that really put me on a good path. But what was wonderful to see when Tony Capon came to see me in Mallorca just in August was he is a co-author of the Lancet and Rockefeller Foundation report on planetary health that came out in 2017. And he shared with me that for him personally, my early publications in scientific journals around my PhD really helped him to frame his understanding of planetary health, which is what the graphic you see on the left of the screen, that the things we do, the health of people and the health of the planet are carefully interlinked, and that we need to manage how we participate appropriately in this complex dynamic biospheric system that we are living part of and co-creators of. And this means we need to affect values, education, regulation, and economic system. And how we do that is through the way we feed ourselves, the way we move around, the way we house ourselves, the way we power the world, and the way we take care of the world, the way we take care of the bioproductivity of the planet. The fundamental value creation of all economies is bioproductivity. And we've forgotten that. We undervalue the work of farmers and foresters and caretakers of the landscape. And what was wonderful is that in these very wide-ranging conversations I had with Tony Capon, I really reconnected with the power of this concept of planetary health and understood that really my work today in regeneration and ecosystems restoration is very much linked to this, and that maybe now is the time that the Planetary Health Alliance has formed, which has 75 universities and government think tanks and institutions around the world working on how we can positively affect the health of ecosystems and the health of the planet in order to positively affect the health of populations and the health of individuals. And so I'm looking forward to collaborating with Professor Capon to build this link between planetary health, ecosystems restoration, and regenerative development. And really that's what I'm trying to share with you in this talk today. These are some graphics from that report from the Lancet, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with it, but it's showing that there are underlying drivers around consumption and demographic shifts and technology. And I would say they should have put the economic system there, because that really is fundamentally the pathological system on the planet. We have a degenerative economy and a money system that cannot give us a regenerative or sustainable future. And unless we address that, we will run into trouble. And that's the Trojan horse in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is SDG number 8, the way we're currently understanding it. Economics measured as GDP is an inadequate measure of progress. And it's an inadequate measure of how we manage our household, our economy. So let me just go on. This is a slide up there. You can see Eric Solheim, who is the current head of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. And he, at a recent landscape forum in Nairobi, put the weight of UNEP behind the call of El Salvador to name the next decade, UN decade, the 2021 to 2030, the UN decade of ecosystems restoration. And he spoke about all the benefits that ecosystems restoration have on multiple levels, from social, economic, ecological impacts that we need to address, and that it's actually much cheaper to address ecosystems restoration now rather than deal with the climate change impacts and the health impacts that failing to do so would produce in the future. And my book that came out in 2016, Designing Regenerative Cultures, also explores all this. It really tries to look at how do we ask the right questions to facilitate multi-stakeholder groups at the local and bioregional scale to explore what a regenerative culture in place in a region with careful sensitivity to the uniqueness of that place in that region could look like. And some of those questions would be things like, how do we transform worldviews and narratives to enable the redesign of human impact on Earth? How do we nurture scale-linking health and resilience through building capacity for local and bioregional participation? I need to collapse this little window here, otherwise I can't see the other question. There's also the question of how do we increase planetary bioproductivity to improve health and healthy ecosystems functions? And how do we design as nature as we transition to regionally circular biomaterials economies? All of that is too complex to explore in an hour-long or 45-minute-long webinar presentation, but my book explores it. Gaia Education's online course in Design for Sustainability, which is to some extent based on the work I did on my PhD, certainly the worldview dimension and the economic dimension. Worldview dimension is very much my PhD. The economic dimension is based on the work I did for my book. And I also co-authored part of the social dimension and the ecological dimension. So if you like the book, go to the course, because that's almost a continuation of it. And now I'm stuck for some reason. Hold on a sec. I have a little bit of a problem with my tech here. Why is it? Okay, next slide. Just for those of you who haven't seen this yet, what do I mean by regeneration? This graphic doesn't, it's an adaptation from my book, but it's really based on the work of Bill Reed and Carol Sanford and people at the Regenesis group. And when I first saw this, and Bill Reed wrote this paper on shifting our mental models, going upstream, shifting the organizing ideas. And I think it was in 2006 that he published this paper. When I first saw it, it really, a light went on saying this is extremely useful, because it shows on a spectrum how we can go from conventional practice to being a little bit better than just following the rules. So using a bit more, are we already done? Oh, wow. I've completely gone too slow to share what I wanted to share. I see I've only got another 5 to 10 minutes left. So briefly, the moving from green to sustainable means moving to the point where we don't have a negative impact anymore. If we move to restorative, we might still do restoration in a way of forcing designs on nature. So we only once we reconciliate our relationship with nature, will we be able to design as nature. I'm going to skip through a few slides now. This is just to remind us that the oldest story on the planet that is written down, the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells the story of downwind desertification, tells the story that don't cut down the forests, otherwise your rivers will run dry. And the image up there, everything that's in red shows how much we've cut down. We really need to go from this situation to this situation. It doesn't quite look like this graphic. If you look at this, this is the current forests on planet Earth, on Gaia. And this is the potential of forest regeneration. And the areas in white are, some of them are deserts, but that doesn't mean that they have to stay deserts. Some of them are grasslands. We can actually regenerate those grasslands and basically capture a lot of carbon in biomaterials and standing forests and healthier soils. And this has already been done. We can move from, let me just check the time, we can move from the left image to the right image in 14 years. This is the work on the Loess Plateau. There's more images of the Loess Plateau, other images of before, after of Earth regeneration. These graphics show that we really need to have a bioregional approach to health and to bringing planetary health back. And the way to do that is to follow the watersheds of the rivers. That's how we can go from national, these straight line boundaries of nations back into a more organic living boundary where we fit the human present back into the watersheds that we live in. I have a sense that we need to have a second seminar, a second webinar of this, so I can go through all these slides that I still have coming up, because I somehow completely got so excited about sharing this with you that I lost track of time. But this is an event that we did at the Commonwealth Secretariat, where we brought a lot of experts together to look at regenerative development to reverse climate change. And the process is slow because politics is slow, but we're nurturing the ground to work with the 31 of the 53 Commonwealth nations to enable regenerative development at a global scale. And I'm just going to give you some inspirational projects that already are happening around the planet now. One of them is the work of the Common Land Foundation that has developed a process of very much akin to permaculture with different zones, protected areas, combined zones where we grow resources and food, and economic zones in a way that we find an economically viable path to large-scale landscape restoration. They've set up, together with the Ecosystems Restoration Camp Foundation, camps, or particularly one camp so far, that are practicing, enabling people to come to a place where this regional regeneration process is happening and enabling them to learn on the job. This is the first prototype ecosystems restoration camp in southeastern Spain. And the work of the Regen Network, which is trying to create a way of measuring the initial state and then the change of state as we're moving into healing landscapes, and using different indicators and using sensors and using satellite sensing to be able to validate regenerative impact on landscapes in order to then flow resources and money to reward this regenerative activity. So they're doing very important work, and it's still somewhat in development, but watch that space. And then also there's this network called the Resilience Broker who is starting a process next year, which is trying to involve 200 city regions around the planet in a process to increase systemic health, to fit regions back, cities back into the conditions of their local bioregion. And of course, you've heard of Paul Hawkins' edited book of Drawdown. We have the technologies. The book highlights 100 proven technologies with which we can draw down carbon and reverse global warming. Recently, the Capital Institute launched a network of regenerative communities. In the bottom right, you can see an image of the people who were at one of the meetings of the launch of the Costa Rican hubs, Eduard Müller, Joe Brewer, people from the Capital Institute. And you can join this new network also online, and it brings people together that are actively working at the regional level to drive regional economic development and ecosystems restoration. Then there's the Regeneration International, which highlights all the regenerative agriculture initiatives around the globe. And there's also people, advanced, open-minded and committed activist companies like Lush have created this prize that I have the honor of being on the board of, that rewards regenerative projects around the planet. So it's actually still open. So if anybody has a project that they're working on, until the 9th of November, you can still apply to be a winner of the Lush Prize for 2019. My friend David McConville at the Buckminster Fuller Institute, while we were working together on this Commonwealth initiative, created this Google map of initiatives that you can click on and watch inspirational videos of regenerative activity around the planet. So if you feel depressed, have a look at that website and enjoy the wonderful activity that is already happening. Also really want to highlight the work of the Regenesis group, because they're really the elders of regenerative practitioners on the planet. I organized the first European regenerative practitioner training with them, and Gaia Education CEO May East and I took part in that. And they really have a wealth of frameworks that help you work in place with people regeneratively. And in the center, these three concentric circles clearly show that regenerative development starts with personal development. And then it's about building your team and the capacity of your team and the capacity of local communities to do the work. And then you move out to do the work to heal the wider system in which whatever you're doing is contained. They, in turn, have been very much informed by the work of Carol Sanford, who has worked with regenerative business and has set up the regenerative business practice. And so all of this is just honoring the elders, that this is not a recent fad that we now call sustainability regenerative. This is actually a specific way of working that has a much, much deeper lineage and has a clear way of doing things somewhat differently than they have been done in sustainable development. And I'm just going to skip through this. I wanted to highlight some of the work of Gaia Education and the flashcards, but Gio has already mentioned this. Do download the Multiplier Handbook. Get yourself a set of these cards. I've got them next to me here. The SDG implementation flashcards. They're extremely useful in bringing the SDGs home to the local community level. I see them as a way of counter-co-opting the somewhat co-opted sustainable development process and really bringing it down to the local level of communities, where people ask the question, how do these goals, how are they meaningful to our community? What are we already doing to implement these aspects? And what can we do to improve the implementation of Agenda 2030? At the core of all this is the way we view the world, the value systems. And that's why I'm bringing this back up. And somebody who's really understood this for a long time is my dear mentor, Joanna Macy, who reminds us that we've been on this path of degenerative development for a very long time, but we're kind of at a very special moment at this point in time, where the extent to which we've caused damage has drastically pushed us to the point where we actually redefining our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to a living earth. And I'm looking forward, despite the fact that there will be collapses and it will be a difficult time, but I'm looking forward of seeing the human story unfold as we move into the age of regeneration. If we get it right, then the 21st century will be remembered as the century of Earth regeneration. And I would like to end with a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke that was translated by Joanna Macy, and it goes, "Dear darkening ground, you have endured so patiently the walls we've built. Maybe you'll give the cities one more hour, cloisters and churches too. And those who labor, maybe you let their work grip them for another 5 hours or 7 until you become forest again and water and widening wilderness in that hour of inexplicable terror when you take back your name from all things. Give me just a little more time. Give me just a little more time so I may love the things until they're real and ripe and worthy of you. So I may love the things until they're real and ripe and worthy of you." I believe that regenerative development fundamentally starts with falling in love with the beauty of this planet, falling in love with each other, falling in love with the potential in humanity. And if we do that, then we might find a way to shape a world that redesigns the human presence on Earth and makes us a regenerative presence. And we fall into the family of things and create conditions conducive to life. I'm sorry that I've gone over. I hope that Gio gives us some time to still have some questions and answers. And then we'll just have an hour and 20-minute webinar. So Gio, you can take over whenever you're ready.
Fantastic presentation, Daniel. I thank you so much for the informative and really quite inspiring presentation on how to use regenerative design to take back our life, take back the human presence on the earth, as you put it at the beginning of the presentation. So thank you so much. Yeah, of course, if we had 5 hours, this could go on for so long because there is so much to regenerative development. There is so much, so many different topics, and hopefully we will organize another webinar, Daniel, if you are willing and available. I know you are a very busy person, and but if we can organize another webinar and you can take from where you left off, that would be wonderful, and I'd be glad to help with that. Don't worry about the time, but I would like to give us maybe another 10 or 15 minutes for some question and answers. I had mentioned at the beginning that I would like people to put their questions in the question and answer box, not in the chat box. The chat box is okay to make comments, and you can all see that. But if you have a specific question, maybe you can... I
can already see one.
Sorry, Dan.
I can already see one. Hello, Joe.
Let's go for it.
I'm glad that Joe's online. Joe has been passionately dedicating his life to this kind of work. And he's actually packing his boxes right now to move to the Regen Hub in Costa Rica to work with our partner, Gaia Education partner, Edward Müller, who set up La Universidad de Cooperación Internacional de Costa Rica. And Joe is going to help him ground the educational initiatives at the first Regen Hub in Costa Rica. And he's asking, I would love to hear your thoughts about practical steps that we can take to train local design practitioners to engage in regenerative practices at the bioregional scale, and how they can begin to weave collaborations across regions to the planetary scale. Thank you, Joe, for that question. I think we're at the beginning of a conversation between the Capital Institute and the Costa Rican Hub and my work on Mallorca to reanimate a piece of work that I've already done for Gaia Education, but we haven't actually actualized it yet, which is working. First, we had the face-to-face course in Eco-Village Design Education, which is a wonderful course to activate people to feel the power of community and become active participants in the redesign of the human presence on Earth at the community level. And then we realized that there's a way of helping these people to deepen in knowledge through an online course, which is the Gaia Education Design for Sustainability course, which is a 400-hour course. And the next development that Gaia Education is still in the middle of is to create a blended learning between these two programs that runs through a year, where people meet people who live in a region meet over every month for a weekend over the course of a year. In between, they have access to studying online, the material of the online course. And they might even meet another time in small study groups that are more localized in their region. And in doing so, we turn all the material that we explore in this puzzle of how do we create a regenerative whole systems design approach to sustainability and regenerative development, we always turn it down to the people in place. And the questions, when they work on sustainable, like alternative currency systems or so on, they explore what already happens in their region, and they explore possibility for implementing these ideas in their region. And then as from year to year, more and more people join the network of people who have gone through this training, the capacity at the regional scale for regenerative and sustainable development grows. And I would hope that we can pilot something like that with the initiative in Costa Rica. I'm also exploring how to pilot something like that on Mallorca. And Joe is going to work a lot with people in Costa Rica to also look at how do we do this even earlier? How do we bring this into schools? How do we bring this into primary and secondary education? That's another really important aspect of this. And Joe's question of how do we link these regional initiatives to global coordination and collaboration. I think the Capital Institute with their regenerative communities in the region hub network have already done the first step of doing so. Let me go to another question. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. As an educator, I'd appreciate your thoughts on how we might educate children about regenerative cultures and development. That's by Kim Gideon. Honestly speaking, as a designer of educational materials and educator, for the longest time, I've been very focused on adult education, on 18 and above. My life has given me an opportunity to rethink that by becoming a father 14 months ago. And I'm only beginning to explore this. I'm part of a network together with Joe, which is called the Global Change Leaders, that was initiated by Ashoka and other organizations that are really looking at the fundamental redesign of the education system. And there are wonderful examples that I could name, like the Center for Ecoliteracy and how they work with school gardens to teach mathematics and whole systems thinking. But I'm really, honestly speaking, still on that journey myself and how to implement this kind of work from a very early age, from kindergarten to primary school to secondary education. And so watch this space. Gaia Education is working on Gaia schools. My colleagues might be able to give a better answer to this at this point. So the next question is Martin. Hi, Daniel. You seem to be doing great work at promoting SDG goals so it's probably but what about the economic growth contradiction of objective number 8 you mentioned? When I read that objective, I was disappointed about the SDGs. Yeah, I agree. I think that's how the neoliberal lobby kind of got the way with the SDGs. I would love to see SDG 8 reframed as qualitative growth, because I'm not necessarily against growth as a biologist and as understanding ecosystems restoration. We want forests to grow. We want the amount of healthy grasslands to grow. We want the amount of bioproductivity on the planet to grow. We want community cohesion and social equity to grow. So growth in itself is not a bad thing, but growth of GDP in a way that you push economic growth in a way that it actually deteriorates cultures and ecosystems is, of course, the wrong path to go. And so for me, that's why I created these cards. They really invite communities to have conversations of how to re-regionalize their economic systems in such a way that we're moving to regional production for regional consumption. And we basically find a pathway towards implementing the SDGs through truly regenerative development. Another question by Cecilia. Hey, thanks for the wonderful webinar. I'm now on my own transition movement, trying to redesign my life to a sustainable one, but it seems very difficult to make it happen. I'm afraid about not having the money and ways of living. How could I start? I'm already studying with Gaia Education. I'm very happy about it. Well, that's wonderful. I think it is a nice place to start. Exploring the Gaia Education professional pathway, doing an EDE, doing the online course, maybe even doing a training of trainers. It's always good to find a community of people. The Buddha said it's the practice, the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha. Finding a community to engage with, not trying to do it all alone, finding like-minded people in small ways is a place to start. And together we can create different economics. When alone we don't have the money, but together we can create conditions that we can build micro systems that are letting us live our values more deeply. But I think your question is one that drives a lot of people at the moment, and it's difficult to build the new world within the restraints of the degenerative economic system that we're currently part of. But just trust your path, and I believe that the tide is turning.
Daniel, maybe we can take just one more question, since we are passing the hour now, and we were planning for 1 hour, but it's wonderful that people have so many great questions and interest. One person is asking if they can have your email to write later. But this one question maybe is a good way to cap off the webinar. How not to lose our humanity in this process and provide support to others?
How not to lose our humanity? Well, this is an interesting one, because I think that we do a lot of talking about humanity and civilization. And if we were honest to ourselves, we should maybe reframe this concept of humanity and this concept of civilization as an aspiration rather than something that we're already in the middle of. And there's nothing humane in the way we treat the community of life at the moment, and we drive the largest age of extinction on planet Earth, one of the great 6 extinctions on planet Earth. There's nothing civil about the way we've created a deeply unsustainable and unequitable world. So maybe true humanity and true civilization is what we get to once we have made that species level rite of passage jump of moving from a immature teenager who thinks just give me and doesn't want to give anything back, to a mature member in the community of life who understands that life creates conditions conducive to life, and that the only way to grow individually and have individual progress is to actually nurture the family of things, nurture the community of life, the community of beings that we are part of. And it is a challenge to, like Joanna Macy, again, I urge you to look at the work that reconnects, because that is a way to really honor your own humaneness and your own connection to the tragedy that is happening, that what we're doing to each other and what we're doing to the rest of the community of life. You have to start to connect to the grief we can feel about this. And out of that grief, we can build an empowerment that actually helps us to act from a different place, where you don't see yourself as a cut-off individual that can't change the big system, where you step into the authority of 3.8 billion years of life's evolution on this planet. And you know that this is the time to speak up as life, for life. And the way to do that is to not demonize anybody, to understand that we're all in this together. Living spaceship Earth is our home, and it's severely damaged at the moment, and we have the chance to pull this together, but only if we overcome our differences, or we celebrate our differences, as different perspectives on this larger whole that we're part of. And we understand that the only way forward is that everybody wins, that we create truly, and this is one of the better lines of the UN process, to create a future where nobody is left behind. And that means having compassion with the people that we currently like to demonize, even mad presidents. So I hope that's an answer to that. And I'm sorry that I can't answer the other questions. I'm also sorry that I ran over a bit, but I'm so passionate about this stuff that I could go on for a number of hours. Bucky Fuller used to give talks that were 6-7 hours long. But I think Gio wants to keep it to as close to an hour as possible. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. And yeah, wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. And I have to apologize that we don't really have time to take on all the questions. We programmed this for 1 hour, and we would like to stick to that because it is being recorded for others to see, and for those who were here to also revisit the recording and the presentation. I want to just end this by pointing out some resources at Gaia Education.
You one quick question, Gio. Is there a way to capture the questions so I can answer the questions on Medium?
Yes, I believe Pedro will help us with that. He'll take down those questions and then he'll send us and people can then catch up on Medium. Thank you for offering that. Anyway, if you are inspired to become a certified trainer with Gaia Education and join our growing roster, there is more and more demand for people to run courses based on the curriculum that Daniel has helped us develop. Please visit our web pages and see the learning journey to become a certified trainer. I also want to point out that the Gaia Education Social Design for Sustainability online course is running right now in English and in Spanish. The Worldview course is running in Portuguese, so please come to our pages if you are interested and join us in those online courses. The SDG flashcards that Daniel referenced several times in his presentation are also available. He was instrumental in developing those flashcards, and we've been using them. I use them all the time in doing presentations on SDGs, workshops, and community conversations. And on top of it, there is a handbook that you can use to follow through to facilitate conversations on the SDGs. Please visit our website and you'll find these for free downloads and also for purchasing. Gaia Education over the years has developed quite a few products, teachers guides, activity guides, eco-villages around the world, the 4 keys. These are all very popular products that you can also find on our websites. Subscribe to our newsletter to find out what other events and new webinars are coming up in the future. We're trying to run a webinar once a month, so please stay tuned. And follow us on our social media. There's a lot of things going on. People are writing all the time, examples of how they are applying the teaching in their lives and in their work are very inspiring indeed. So thank you, Daniel, and thank you all the participants in this webinar. Hope to see you next time.